Genesis 1 was a really interesting story. It told us all about God's creative process to create a perfect world for His creatures. As we will see throughout the Bible, the humans are the main focus of the whole creation. God decided to tell us more about how He created man and what exactly happened on day 6. So let's talk about that. God formed a man and gave him the garden in Eden, except the tree of good and evil. Adam was alone, so God made a woman as his partner. Now, I'm sure that we are all familiar with this story, but I can tell you that there are a lot more interesting things that we are going to be discussing apart from what was discussed in this summary. Thus, the heavens and the earth were finished and all the host of them. Now, I quickly want to take you back to the end of the previous chapter. Remember that we ended off the previous chapter by seeing that God looked back at everything that He created and that everything was very good. So now in this chapter we are seeing that God is signing off His creation as done. Also note that this verse is telling us that God is done creating. However, as Matthew Henry pointed out in his commentary, in miracles He has overruled nature but never changed its settled course or added to it. So God is officially done creating, however He will still be interacting with His creation to make sure that everything goes according to plan. And on the 7th day, God ended His work which He had made, and He rested on the 7th day from all His work which He had made. And God blessed the 7th day, and sanctified it, because that in it He had rested from all His work which God created and made. So here we see that God rested on the 7th day, and that He sanctified it and made it holy. This will be a very important verse to remember when we start talking about doctrines in the Bible. I'm sure you all know what this doctrine is going to be. However, we will talk more about that when we get to those specific chapters in the Bible. Also, a lot of people have pointed out that the Bible never says here that it was evening and morning the 7th day. Now, this could purely be something that doesn't mean anything at all, or it could have a really significant meaning. I'm not sure on which camp I am yet. I haven't been able to find anything that I feel is definitely right for this verse, but I have heard a few ideas. For example, I've heard that this means that God is still resting to this day, that His resting is gonna go on forever. However, I'm not sure that I really agree with that, because if He is still resting, then why did He intervene into this world and, for example, send Jesus to save us? That doesn't sound a lot like resting to me. However, I do have my own idea about this. Remember how I pointed out in the Genesis 1 video that each day of creation could represent 1,000 years in Earth's lifespan? To add on to this idea, this passage will then suggest that after the 7,000th year, it will continue on to eternity. There will be no evening and morning after the 7,000th year. So I'm purely suggesting that it is adding to the symbolism. However, I don't really know if this is a good idea or not. These are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created, in the day that the Lord God made the earth and the heavens. This verse is probably the verse I've spent the most amount of time on. The reason for this is that I couldn't really find a foolproof interpretation of this verse. So for now, I will just be taking the verse in the following two ways. The first way to interpret this verse is by saying that this verse is merely saying that everything we've heard up until now from Genesis 1 is the true account of how the heavens and the earth were created. Now, what really threw me off in this verse is the "these are," which tells me that everything that is going to follow this verse is going to be this account. But that to me doesn't make 100% sense, because after this verse we will just be reading the story of Adam and Eve, which is not really the account of the heavens and the earth. Then I've also heard something that, if it is true, would be very cool. Remember how most scholars agree that Moses wrote Genesis? Well, there would be two ways for him to know the information that he has written down in Genesis 1. Either this information was passed on from generation to generation until it reached Moses, or Moses found the information already written down onto clay tablets or something like that. both of these could actually be the case as well. Now, the argument here says that since no one was alive at the time God created everything, no one would know how exactly it happened, except for God. Therefore, God must have written Genesis 1 himself, and therefore is represented by the generations of the heaven and earth. Then in Genesis 5 verse 1, we see the generations of Adam in a very similar verse, which could indicate that Adam wrote everything from Genesis 2 up until Genesis 4. However, I'm not banking on either one of these two ideas to be 100% correct. I'm merely telling you about some ideas that I have heard. Now, stick around because I will revisit this idea in Genesis 5 and talk about it a little bit more. And every plant of the field before it was in the earth, and every herb of the field before it grew, for the Lord God had not caused it to rain upon the earth, and there was not a man to till the ground. Now, this verse is actually quite interesting to me, because it says that no plants have grown yet because God hadn't caused it to rain yet. Also, this passage says that there was no man to till the ground. So this part of the verse tells me that what is about to follow is going to tell us how God created man, because he hasn't created any of them yet. So in other words, this passage is saying that there was plants and herbs in the field, just like God created them on day 3, they just haven't started growing yet. Now, there is a quick question I want to pose to people who believe in the Bible and in evolution. And here I'm just going to use the idea that Michael Jones from Inspiring Philosophy believes. He believes in evolution. In other words, there were already people around and God simply selected Adam and Eve to be the high priest representing humanity. Now, if that was the case, then why would the Bible say that there was no man to till the ground? Because obviously there would have been hundreds or thousands of them, right? Anyways, I think that's just an interesting thought, and by the way, I am planning to react to a video where Michael Jones from Inspiring Philosophy explains everything that he believes and how evolution is compatible with the Bible. So if you would like to see that, then you have to subscribe. But there went up a mist from the earth and watered the whole face of the ground. Now, the first ever rain on earth is described as being mist. Now, this gives me the idea that since we have this ice canopy around the earth, it might not have been possible for clouds to form. I understand that this might be quite far-fetched, but I honestly don't have any other idea for why this would be mist and not just normal rain. And the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. Okay, so here we have man created, and a very important thing to notice is that we were created out of dust. I'm sure many of you know what my channel name is, Created from Dust, and this name is actually a direct consequence of this verse. Now, I thought it would be interesting just to tell you guys why I chose this name. You see, about 2 or 3 years ago, I was watching Kent Hovind a lot, especially his debates. And if you have ever watched the Kent Hovind debate, you will know that he likes to insult the atheist by saying that they came from a rock. On another occasion, Kent Hovind just straight up said that evolution is dumb, and the atheist took the opportunity to say the following.
Yes or no? Does a whale and a banana have a common ancestor if we go back millions, billions, trillions of years?
Yes.
Okay, that's dumb.
Okay, I mean, it's not as dumb as, say, humans coming from dirt that was proved into existence by God.
And my answer to that is, yes, I do believe that, and you're a bit wrong, because actually we were made from dust, not dirt. Also, we were created from dust. We don't believe that we just randomly popped up from dust. Anyways, that's where the channel name comes from, and I thought you guys might have been interested to hear. Also, we see another very interesting thing here. God breathes the breath of life into the nostrils of the man. The Bible will, however, revisit this idea when we talk about the flood, so when we get to that story, we'll talk about this again. The important thing, however, to take away from this is that the breath of life is needed for life to exist, which means that purely from a biblical perspective, life. Evolution is impossible because the breath of life was never breathed into anything. It is all just random chance. And the Lord God planted a garden eastward in Eden, and there he put man whom he had formed. And out of the ground made the Lord God to grow every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food, the tree of life also in the midst of the garden, and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So there is this idea out there that Genesis 2 is just a different creation story from Genesis 1. And this is a big talking point for inconsistencies in the Bible, because we just read that man was made before plants. But in Genesis 1, plants were made on day 3 and man was made on day 6. And there are a few other similar things that they also point out in this chapter, but all of that can be refuted with this one argument. Did you notice the word garden in this verse? In other words, God created the plants for the garden, not the plants for the whole world. The plants that were made on day 3 is the plants that exist all over the earth. Whereas here, the trees are only created in the garden. Then we see that two special trees were also in the garden: the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. This to me means the following. Adam and Eve probably did not have a very encapsulating perspective about what good and evil was. And I think the knowledge of good and evil probably wasn't even necessary, because in the garden they had everything that they needed, so there was no reason to sin. So the knowledge of good and evil wasn't necessary for them to know. However, and we'll talk about this a bit later on as well, in order for them to have free will, they need to be able to decide whether they want to know about good and evil or not. As Matthew Henry pointed out much later in his commentary, in their state of innocence and separated from any others, what opportunity or what temptation had they to break any of the 10 commandments? Moving on to the tree of life, this tells me that if they probably ate of this tree every day or every week or whatever, they would keep on living and theoretically never die. I also think that this was part of God's original plan, that people will live forever. Because by the way, that is part of the plan in the new heaven and earth. Now, another thing I want to point out about Matthew Henry's commentary on this verse is the following. The place fixed upon for Adam to dwell in was not a palace, but a garden. The better we take up with plain things, the less we seek things to gratify pride and luxury, the nearer we approach to innocency. Those are some pretty powerful words, I would say. And a river went out of Eden to water the garden, and from there it was parted and became into 4 heads. The name of the first is Pison. That is it which compasseth the whole land of Havilah, where there is gold. And the gold of the land is good. There is bdellium and the onyx stone. And the name of the second river is Gihon. The same is it that compasseth the whole land of Utopia. And the name of the third river is Hiddekel. That is it which goeth towards the east of Assyria. And the fourth river is Euphrates. The information presented in these verses always seemed very unnecessary to me. Why would we ever need to know which rivers were in Eden? Well, if I had to guess, I would say that this is to help us locate where exactly the Garden of Eden was. However, I'm not sure why that would be necessary though. Now, the location of the garden is just out of the scope of what I want to achieve with these videos. So if you would like to know more about that, there are some other Bible studies out there that do go deeper into this question. And the Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to dress it and to keep it. So here we see that God put man in the garden to look after the garden. I think there's actually a very strong case to be made here about doing work itself. And I would like to point out Matthew Henry's commentary on this point as well. Even in paradise itself, man had to work. None of us were sent into the world to be idle. Also, there is true pleasure in the business God calls us to and employs us in. Adam could not have been happy if he had been idle. It is still God's law. He that will not work has no right to eat. And the Lord God commanded the man, saying, Of every tree of the garden thou mayest freely eat, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil thou shalt not eat of it. For in the day that thou eatest thereof, thou shalt surely die. As you probably know, these two verses set out the plot where the dingleberries will hit the fan. You see, God made a lot of beautiful trees in the garden who all bear yummy fruits that Adam could eat. eat. However, he gave Adam the instruction to not eat of a specific fruit. Now, there has been arguments made to suggest that God here is not all-loving. The general argument goes like this: why would God create the tree of knowledge of good and evil if, with his all-knowing attribute, he knew that Eve would eat of the fruit? Well, to that I would say that God gave us free will. If Adam and Eve did not have the opportunity to know what the difference between good and evil was, they would never truly have free will. And this is simply because there would be a possible option out there for them to choose, which they will never be able to choose even if they wanted to. Now, this begs the question, does free will exist, and why do we need free will to exist? Well, I think it's very obvious that free will does exist. So let's focus on the point of why we need free will. Well, I'm going to start off by saying that if I was God, I would want the people that I created to worship me because they truly believe that I exist and they truly want to have a relationship with me. I wouldn't want them to worship me just because they don't know about anything else. That would in essence make them robots. So yeah, there's a lot more I can say about this, but I think that encapsulates the main point that is being made. Also, we need to quickly talk about the fact that God says that if Adam eats of this specific fruit, then he will surely die. This to me means one of two things. Either Adam would never die and continue to live on forever unless he eats of the fruit, or this fruit is poisonous and the moment he eats of it, he will immediately die. As we will see later in this chapter, the former is true. And the Lord God said, "It is not good that the man should be alone. I will make him an helpmeet for him." Now this to me is very interesting. It is not good for a man to be alone. Either this could be literally in Adam's situation, that he will be bored out of his mind if he was just alone in this garden forever. Or it could have the wider implication that it is not good for any human that will ever live to be alone. And as we know these days from angry single feminists and leftists, this might be more true than we think. And out of the ground the Lord God formed every beast of the field and every fowl of the air, and brought them unto Adam to see what he would call them. And whatsoever Adam called every living creature, that was the name thereof. So in this verse we have another example of the order of creation being jumbled up. In Genesis 1, we see animals being created before man. However, in Genesis 2, we see that man is created before animals. Well, I think this is very similar to the plant situation. God already made all of the animals for the world, but now he has to make another one of every kind of animal for Adam to give a name to. Because remember, at this point in time, there are only plants in the garden. So God had to create the animals for the garden as well. And Adam gave names to all the cattle and to the fowl of the air and to every beast of the field. But for Adam there was not found an helpmeet for him. So here we see that even though Adam saw every creature that was created by God and gave every creature a name, he did not want any of them to be his helper. And to be honest, I can't think of a single animal that would be a good helper to humans. Even though animals like dogs can be a human's best friend, they will never be what another human can be to a man. Animals are just not sufficient enough for our needs. We need other humans with us. And the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall upon Adam, and he slept. And he took one of his ribs and closed up the flesh instead thereof. And the rib which the Lord God had taken from the man made he a woman, and brought her unto the man. And Adam said, "This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man." Here it is very interesting to see that God did not make the woman like he made the man. He created the woman from the man and not from the ground. So again, the woman is the helper for the man, and their relationship should be very tight, as we will see in the next verse. verse. Therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh. And they were both naked, the man and his wife, and were not ashamed. Isn't it interesting to think that God already gave us marriage before we have even met the first characters in this chapter? This to me just emphasizes how important marriage is, and how important it is to just have one sex partner, because you have to become one flesh with your woman. The only way I can think of that happening is through sex. Also, I think another reason God created Eve from Adam's rib and not from the ground is because it makes it easier symbolically for them to become one flesh again. There's plenty more of what we just talked about in other books of the Bible, but for now you already have a glimpse of what is to come. It is also important to remember this last part of the verse that said that they were naked, but they were not ashamed about it. This is going to become important in the next chapter. So there you have it, my brothers and sisters. That's Genesis 2 in a nutshell. And I have to say, there are a lot of interesting ideas in this chapter just floating around, ready to be grasped at and studied. Now, with all of that said, if you would like to see how Adam and Eve messes up their stay in the garden in the worst possible way, then make sure to check out the video on screen right now. Thank you all for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed and that you will join me on many more. Cheers!